So I just wanted to begin introducing the research team, and then also wanted to just begin with an acknowledgement of the territory that we're on Mississauga territory here. So the research team for this project includes myself and Margaret and Krista Shore, who did the interviewing, and Krista Shore is a member of the community in Regina, where we're doing this work, and she did an amazing job with the interviewing and with, in relation to this project. And then Jacqueline Smith was also working as a research assistant, doing some transcribing and helping with some of the research. So I wanted to just turn it over to Margaret, because this was a collaborative project, and just turn it over to you to say a little bit about All Nations Network.
Sure. Tamse, Ani, Mdewane Okeja Tasqueo, kind-hearted warrior woman, and I'm a Korean Soto woman from the prairies, from over there. Treaty 4 was enlightened in the talks last night in the session in here about the treaties in this area of this land now called Canada. And I was delighted to be part of this research. And All Nations Hope, I'm the CEO there. And so part of our work and our way forward as Indigenous people is to take part in research. Research that will bring life to Indigenous people in the communities. And you know, if you want to look further into the work of Krista Shore, you're welcome to. She's public. She lives with HIV. Is an advocate for women and HIV. And so you know, search into some of the research that she's already been involved in. And so we were happy to have her join our team as we move forward in doing research with the community. All Nations Hope, we really look at members that will take part in the work, in our ways as Indigenous people, take part in the ceremonies. So one of the things I want to mention first and foremost is that we did do ceremony for this research, because in the end we do this for the people, for the human beings, and we want good things to happen for the people as they move forward and begin to tell a story. And so Emily has been very good at being able to take part in our ceremonies and understanding that this is what needs to happen before we can work with a researcher to work on research in general, that we have to see what will happen in the end, where the life will come for the people. And this is a living project, a living document that we will use at All Nations Hope, and we will also ask our partners who work with us in different areas to be able to access this information, this research, so that we can begin to work closer together in unity and understanding one another's ways. As an Indigenous woman, I'm very strong in that area in terms of understanding how, at the end of the day, that this research will bring life to the people, and it'll bring an understanding and be able to tell a story that's a truthful story of what is happening with Indigenous people in this land called Canada and the law that is here. As Indigenous people, we have our own laws, and some of those ways forward, we have to look at how we can work together in ways that will help and be a benefit to the human beings that are under these laws now. And so I'm just going to leave it at that, and let's get going here, because I know the time is of the essence.
Thanks. All right, so it's kind of the outline of what we're going to look at. I'm just going to jump right in here and start talking about Canadian criminal law in relation to HIV non-disclosure. As Margaret talked about, though, you know, too often when people are talking about law, people will talk about the law, and usually people are talking about settlers' laws and universalize that as though that's the only law in this place, which is inaccurate and perpetuates particular colonial approaches to law. So it's important to keep Indigenous laws in mind. The focus of this kind of part where we're looking at in this project is on the impacts of Canadian settler laws related to HIV non-disclosure on Indigenous people. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context in relation to the ways that the state of law currently in this area. So there are lots of ways that you could talk about law in relation to HIV non-disclosure in various contexts, and we're focusing specifically on contexts with sexual partners. So if someone is HIV positive and they're in a sexual relationship with someone, what is it, according to Canadian law, that a person is expected to have to disclose or not disclose, and why, and what are the repercussions if a person does not and is found guilty. So basically there are no set laws in Canada that are written about HIV non-disclosure. Rather, it's other parts of the criminal code that get drawn on. So, for example, aggravated sexual assault is what I will just mention in a little moment here. But so there have been different approaches. So, obviously then people who are HIV positive would want to know, well, what are the laws? What are the expectations? What are the issues going on here in terms of how a person might be charged? But unfortunately, it's not overly clear in terms of what the response is. So again, there's not written laws, but what Canadian courts have tried to do is to assess risk. And there are two kind of significant moments, I guess, in terms of, two significant moments in relation to cases that have gone through the Supreme Court. So Courier was one of the decisions where they tried to outline some of the ideas around risk and when a person might need to disclose. I'm going to be very brief about that and just say it was really vague. So next came along Mevior and DC. So these two cases going together, and in those cases, the response, it was decided that a person should not have to disclose their HIV positive status if a condom is used properly and if the person also had a low viral load at the time. With this, then, that was a case where it was based on a heterosexual couple. We're talking very specifically about vaginal intercourse in that case. And so there were a lot of questions still about, well, how might this apply in other circumstances? Since then, in courts, judges have made decisions in ways that have varied from what was stated in these cases. Sometimes it's consistent with that, sometimes it's not. So there's a lot of variation. And overall, it can be described as a punitive approach, that it's a pretty high standard in relation to risk and how that's being assessed. And historically, there have been shifts from nuisance charges being applied to now the most common charge is aggravated sexual assault. So it's increasingly punitive in terms of how people are being responded to. So there was a response in December from the federal government trying to address issues with criminalization of HIV and non-disclosure. With that response, basically the response was that there's a problem and that this response is too harsh. It's not in line with medical knowledge in relation to transmission related to HIV. But they were quite silent on how all of this relates to Indigenous people who are HIV positive, and as well, it's not known what will become of that report, right? So that didn't change anything in the particular moment. So it remains to be seen how it is that will change things or not. Okay, so getting into the research then. So, with that report, with research that's done on HIV non-disclosure, there's not conversation about Indigenous peoples, not meaningful, sustained conversations about how it is that Indigenous peoples are being impacted by these laws around non-disclosure. And Indigenous laws, as we started to talk about, aren't part of those conversations as well. And so this is a significant issue. HIV stigma intersects with other forms of oppression and discrimination, and it's also really crucial to keep in mind a colonial context when we're thinking about then how these laws are operating and that they're impacting Indigenous people in very specific and distinct ways. Okay, so I'm just going to bring all of this up here. So with the research then, so in the, didn't have the abstract. Okay, so I was just going to correct something. So there were 26 interviews that we're drawing on here, and these interviews were done within the past year at All Nations Hope Network, and Krista Shore was doing the interviewing. And so the interviews were with people who are Indigenous and HIV positive, as well as with people who are working to support this community in Regina. So here's the breakdown then in terms of who was involved. So 96% of participants were Indigenous, 81% of the people involved were women, 65% of the participants were HIV positive, and then there were also, so in terms of the different groups of people involved, so 14 people who are community members and HIV positive, 3 people who are community workers and also HIV positive, and then 9 people who are community workers but not HIV positive. And then 6 elders were also involved. So pseudonyms are going to be used throughout. Okay, so there are, as I had mentioned, and as the participants made very clear, there are very distinct ways in which Indigenous people who are HIV positive are being impacted by the laws around non-disclosure. So the first one here is fear of incarceration. So there's as you could imagine, with the laws being unclear, there's a fear of incarceration. And then on top of this, there are issues with over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, racial profiling, very particular forms of surveillance that target Indigenous communities. And so these are added on to fears of incarceration for Indigenous people. So Clement, one of the elders, he said, instead of having these big jails full of people, we should be having a big place for Indigenous people, you know. People that need help, people that have to be there, work together, deal with this issue, talk about it, spread our heart out, bring the people in. You know, get together, show some love, and show some people that you can be loved no matter what you have. This is what I think should be done. And he also said, I would leave the Canadian law out because what the law is going to do is going to throw you in jail and forget about you. So there were concerns about incarceration. There's also concerns that were raised from participants about really negative impacts then on sexual relationships. So people shying away from intimacy, people shying away from relationships because of a fear of being charged, and also a fear of spreading HIV as well. But law was also, you know, part of this in terms of a fear of being charged. So the laws are having particularly negative impacts where people are feeling isolated. One of the elders, Old Lady Buffalo, she also talked about residential schools and the impacts of residential schools on healthy sexualities in Indigenous communities. So impositions of ideas about sex and sexuality that were very shame-based, caused a lot of trauma. And so she raised concerns about how it is that the HIV non-disclosure, or the laws around HIV non-disclosure, are an additional mechanism that ends up undermining healthy sexualities in Indigenous communities. So related as well is the issue of gendered violence. So I'm going to just jump back for a second here with a quote from someone. So Joe, an Indigenous community member who's HIV positive, said, yes, I do want a boyfriend, but I'm scared. I'm scared to tell them. I don't want to have sex with you because I have HIV, you know? I'm scared to even go to bed with anybody, even to kiss them or anything. I just push them away all the time. It's just frightening, you know? And then Miwa Sin, a support worker who's also HIV positive, she said, a lot of people think they're going to be alone for the rest of their lives because of those laws. Those laws, they've given us basically no options. Okay, so gendered violence then has also been related to the conversations that participants were having about fears in relation to sex and in relationships with other people. So with this, you know, Indigenous women already face really high disproportionate amounts of gendered violence. And concerns were raised about Indigenous women who are HIV positive being manipulated and threatened by men So having people take advantage of them, so taking advantage of people in terms of saying, if you don't do this, then I'll tell people you're HIV positive. So threatening women in relation to resources, threatening women in relation to sex was also talked about. So Iskoteo, a community member who is HIV positive, she said, say all of a sudden my partner wants to charge me for this, because he thought, wants to charge me for, giving him whatever. And I told him before that, it's totally up to you. And then all of a sudden turns around and wants to charge me for that and put me in jail for something, stupid. So concerns were also raised about sexual violence, and research, other research has also shown that it can be difficult for women who are HIV positive to ask partners to wear condoms, and there can often be violence in those moments. So there's significant power issues that need to be considered. And so this was also talked about in the research by participants, talking, for example, about experiencing sexual assault. So another thing, another key issue that participants talked about was discrimination from police. So participants talked about several experiences with discrimination, that police are often targeting Indigenous people generally, but also are targeting Indigenous people who are HIV positive. And HIV stigma in Regina, and we can think about this elsewhere, also plays out in ways in which Indigenous people as a whole are treated as though everyone's HIV positive, and Indigenous women in particular being blamed. So there's a lot of racial stereotypes there. So people talked about experiencing police violence from family members because of family members' HIV status. People talked about experiencing police violence themselves, being discriminated against. And then related to that is this general issue with criminalization overall for being Indigenous and for being HIV positive. So Muskwa, a community worker who's not HIV positive, said, like Indigenous and non-Indigenous are two different category and groups of people being treated as criminal. Like, obviously Indigenous people always get the short end of the stick when it comes to criminal charges or whatever, because they get the maximum of whatever, right? But Indigenous people, I think they will have a hard time to disclose, because then they're labeled right away. People will label them, and that's my view. So part of the research then, we were looking at services and supports in Regina. And there was a lot of positive comments about the great work that's being done at All Nations Hope Network. And there were also concerns raised that there's a need for expanded and revised services in the city. And so you can see here from the list the need for education, for example, and I'll point this out because of the conference that we were at, but one of the participants said, people need to be talking about this when they're teaching in law classes. People need to be teaching about HIV non-disclosure, and people need to be teaching about how it is that Indigenous people experience this in different and particular ways. So there's lots of information here that we could talk about, but I've got the 3 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's switch to recommendations then. So there's a report that we're working on, a policy and law report, as well as a document for the community. And in this report, there are some recommendations. And so I wanted to just draw out a couple key ones here, and because of time, want to just speak to a couple specifically. So that evaluations and discussions of Canadian criminal laws around HIV non-disclosure need to center the experiences and knowledge of Indigenous people living with HIV. Evaluations and discussions of Canadian criminal laws around HIV non-disclosure need to meaningfully acknowledge and engage with the broader legal and settler colonial context that Indigenous peoples have historically dealt with and currently face. And another key one to draw out here is there's a need for discussion and engagement with Indigenous legal experts in relation to Indigenous legal responses to issues as they relate to HIV. So I want to just, for ending this, turn this over to Margaret to talk a little bit more, if you don't mind, just about, you know, moving forward from here.
Sure. You know, one of the things I think about when I look at an institution, a system, or an agency that is set in place in this land to deal and to help providing that care, treatment, and support for people living with HIV, is the fact that as Indigenous people from this land, that we have the solutions for what we're faced with today. And so, you know, being someone who is quite involved in a ceremonial lifestyle, in medicine, in ceremonies and teachings, in the language. Those are things that we need to understand as Indigenous people that will bring life to our communities, to our nations. And as we walk alongside, I see we have to walk alongside with those that came here. Because the best of both of all nations, and I speak, you know, I work for all nations, hope. And, you know, today we say we're done hoping, that we have the solutions for what we are faced with today. But the other nations that came to this land, you brought your gifts that we need to bring forward and to work together. We have our gifts here already as Indigenous people, but we have to work alongside. So, you know, I went to a ceremony once because I live with this disease called diabetes. And the ancestors, the spirits, they told me in the ceremony that you're taking medicine or you're taking medication, but there'll be a time when you'll be offered medicine and you'll know when that time comes. But for now, you'll walk in this way. Continue taking your medication. And these are you know, from my way, the way I believe, these are my ancestors who talk about medication. They knew that there would be this medication, but we have the medicine that we also have to walk alongside. And I tell people that we have our own doctors, we have our own pharmacists, we have our own nurses, and we have our own lawyers. We have people who talk about the laws that our people had here on this land prior to the settlers coming. And so we have to walk alongside each other. And the best thing I can say for today is, as we move forward, is that we need to have Indigenous navigators out there that are navigating the people through these institutions, these systems, and these agencies that are set out there for the care, treatment, and support of people who are most at need for whatever condition that they're faced with, and around poverty, homelessness, some of the diseases. So those are things that I think about and the solutions that I want to bring to life as we move forward. And to understand us as Indigenous people, it's important to develop relationships, to sit in ceremony with Indigenous people. If you're involved in the work or you want to do research, sit with the Indigenous people and learn from us, because we have learned from you. I think last night I was present to listen to an Indigenous woman from this land talk about the relationship that needs to happen. You know, the one thing I want to say is that you're in positions of authority where you can look at this process and how do we work together in a way that will bring good things for the people, that you'll be part of that healing and that wellness that has to happen on this land. And one of the things I want you to think about is, where did you come from? Where did your ancestors come from? And why did they come here? Why did they come to this land? And then forgive them for what they did to my ancestors, because I know that path I had to take myself, is to forgive my ancestors for what happened to me, and the trauma and the things that I still carry in my own life with my own family and my own nation. And so when you begin to think that way, and in the earlier session here that I heard a lady talk about forgiveness, I had to forgive my ancestors. And you know, when people want to come and work with All Nations Hope, I ask where they're from. And I want them to do that work with their ancestors, to ask those questions of what happened when your ancestors came to this land. Did they turn their back when the government was doing what it did to Indigenous people? And so if they did, it's like watching a woman get beat up and you don't say nothing today, right? And so you carry that. And sometimes it's overcompensated in how you want to save us or how you want to control us. And that's what these policies do and these laws do and continue to do in this land, is to try to control us and to save us. But those days of salvation are over for Indigenous people as we stand before places like this and talk about the true solutions and talk about the truth of what happened in this land. And it's not to discredit any of your ancestors, because your ancestors, my belief is your ancestors are in the room here today, as my ancestors are. And the ancestors are the people that are from this land, this area. And we're looking for solutions. And they're pushing us to talk this way with one another and to think about different ways of moving forward with one another as human beings, because we all come from the same place. We all come from the same place. And that unity has to happen for us to change the laws of this land and to understand the laws of the Indigenous people of this land so that we can work together in looking at a better way forward for the people. Hi, hi.